And a lot of people here in the audience will have no big P politics, but they'll be interested in how this affects the politics of Sweden. How has it affected the sort of, I mean, they've got a conservative government at the moment, but the social democracy of Sweden generally?
That's I think...
Because you got the Orwell Prize for this, so come on.
All right. Okay. No. I was in Helsinki last month, and some kind of grand international press yippo and asked to talk about, is the Nordic model exportable? And I said, absolutely not, because what made the Nordic social democracies was not. It's not the stuff that you can go to Stockholm and talk to the ministers about, and they say, well, we have these laws and those laws, and it all works wonderfully, and why don't you do the same thing? Well, the answer is because you're not Swedes. Essentially, Swedish social democracy grew out of this, and Nordic social democracy generally grew out of at least three things that we don't have in this country. There was, for a start, it was a very hierarchical and obedient and ordered society in the 30s, up until the 1970s. People were terribly formal, everybody knew their place with an exact, to an extraordinary degree. I mean, much more so even than in this country, which is thought of as class conscious. Secondly, you had the basic social unit wasn't the city, and it wasn't really the country, it was the small town. And in a small town, everybody knows everybody depends on everybody else. And there's this extraordinary mixture of competition and sort of personal enterprise, because everybody has to do their best or else you all go under. But at the same time, a very strong cooperative spirit, a very strong spirit that you're part of a greater whole and that nobody must be allowed to get above themselves. People talk about the politics of envy, but actually without envy you wouldn't accomplish anything social democratic. And because on top of that, you then had a very high degree of literacy and very confident, a small, self-confident governing class who were able to say, well, we want this to happen, and it would happen. Yeah.
Would it be?
Well, this, I think, is the thing which you might envy most. And none of those things are really true here. And of course, there was also the great cultural homogeneity. There was, until 20 or 30 years ago, there was no immigration to speak of.
Can I just explore two things? I'd like to come back to that. I'm not supposed to be interviewing you, but anyway, it's supposed to be in the conversation. But I would love us to come back to the latter point about the homogeneity of Sweden. But can I just take you back to the small town? Because there was an interesting discussion on the Today programme this morning about what size of unit can you really operate a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
They were talking about, well, 6,000, they actually started off with 600, but they decided that 6,000 was a really good unit to be able to have a place where people knew each other and where things could work like a clock. And I wondered if that's true in the Swedish context, maybe not the 6,000, but small enough for people to relate with big distances in between.
Well, that's certainly the pattern on which the country was formed. I don't think that's any longer true. Everybody's now gathered into these quite remarkably alienating little clusters of satellite towns around the big cities. Almost everybody lives either in Stockholm or near it, or in Malmö in the south, or around Göteborg.
They're much more like us then now.
Yes,
Is that why they voted Conservative?
That's a chunk of it, but if you want to talk about the collapse of social democracy, that's another problem. But David, actually, look, even Conservatives, I was talking the other day to the Conservative Labour Market Minister, who's a kind of Swedish politics don't map onto British
I
politics.
met him in March as well. He
Literally?
was hosting the seminar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what struck me was that he cared in a way that a British Conservative would not, in my experience. He really cared.
He'd been
about
right
people.
around the country. He'd been talking to people in the areas of greatest unemployment
Yeah,
in a systematic way, which I was very impressed with.
yeah. And he was, you know, he took for granted that there was such a thing as society and he was part of it. It's that feeling of linkage between the top and the bottom which I think is distinctly Scandinavian and not present here.
People may want to come back to this, but what is the reason for the collapse? Because that will get us into what made it up a bit more in the first place, if you could just describe it.
Well, the short form is that the money ran out. I mean, when I was living there, there was still a lot of heavy industry. There was a shipyard in Utopia where I lived. There were shipyards in Gothenburg at the bottom of the river. There was a big car factory in Trollhättan where they made Saabs, and a bloody great big Volvo factory outside.
And they're going now, aren't they? Saab's been
Shipyard's gone. Saab has been sold off to another dodgy billionaire who will almost certainly run it into the ground. Volvo will be sold off as soon as Ford can find anyone to buy it.
These are seminal changes, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean it's huge. But the trouble is that globalization is the other way to look at it. Swedish workers were able to pay themselves extremely well. They work damn hard. They work much, much harder than English workers, in my experience. But in the end, you know, they couldn't. There's no particular reason to pay a Swede 10 times as much as a Chinese worker. And so, without the high wages, the high taxes become unsustainable. And so the whole thing starts toppling over. And if you talk now to Swedish Social Democrats, they'll tell you, they'll boast about how deregulated the place is. What a wonderful place it is to do business in, because you know there are hardly any taxes, no bureaucracy, no anything.
A bit like us from '97, really.
but without the finance nonsense. Because they had their banking crisis and they sat on their banks a lot harder than we did.